Olin, and salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever or wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here on the 10th of June, 2021, on the day of a solar eclipse, and my purpose today is to talk about the Kalki Avatar. A while ago, I uploaded a talk on the timing of Kali Yuga, and some elements of that talk are relevant to the Kalki Avatar because there is a timing factor involved in the appearance of that entity, whoever that may be. Kalki and Kali, of course, in English and even in Sanskrit, sound very close. They are not necessarily etymologically close. The Kalki is a figure who appears at the end of the Kali Yuga, at the conclusion, which is now, current. According to my calculations, carried out over several decades, which are meticulous, based on the correlation of different ancient chronologies, I put the end date of the Kali Yuga at 2216 on the conventional calendar. So we're just under 200 years from the close of Kali Yuga. And if you consider one cosmic day of 25,920 years, one kalpa, compared to a human day, we would be living in the last 10 minutes of the day. So where do I start? Well, first of all, it would be helpful if I advise you about certain detours. Don't go down these roads. They will not lead to any insight about the Kalki Avatar. There's an ongoing theme in world mythology and in the world religions, the theme of the Messiah. And all world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam primarily, contain in their narrative the promise of a Messiah to come. So the expectation of the Messiah is a very big deal in these global mainstream religions, isn't it? So the Muslims await their Mahdi, I think that's what he's called, and the Christians await their Messiah. There are various versions of the Messiah to come. One of them would be, say, the second coming of Christ. That's a messianic narrative in Christianity. And of course, the Messiah theme is written very deeply and insidiously into the narrative of Judaic religion as well. I'm not talking about Messiah, so just sidetrack that issue, that theme, and don't even think about it as you listen to what I say now. The Kalki Avatar is not a messianic figure. Another detour to avoid would be the Buddhist narrative, according to which there is a future Buddha, a Buddha to come in the future, and many traditions give an account, different accounts of this future Buddha, both in the Pali canon of Theravada from southern India and in the Mahayana. They expect a Buddha to come in the declining moments of Kali Yuga. So the Kali Yuga time frame does apply to the coming of the Buddha of the future, who has been called the Maitreya. But elsewhere, I have written and spoken extensively about the Maitreya, so I want to emphasize that the Maitreya is not the Kalki Avatar either. Thirdly, you come to Hinduism, and as a matter of fact, in Hinduism, there is a narrative that contains reference to the Kalki Avatar. That's really where it's from. So there is a narrative sequence in Hinduism that goes back to the Puranas, which is called the 10 avatars of Vishnu. And according to this narrative, this story, this myth, the dreaming god Vishnu has intervened in the world as an avatar, meaning one who descends, has intervened not in this world we're living in now, but in other worlds at various times, going back into prehistory and into a purely mythological dimension of narrative. The interesting thing about the sequence of the 10 avatars of Vishnu is that it does come down into historical time. So, as it is generally read, the 8th or 9th avatar of Vishnu can be identified with Krishna in the Mahabharata. Now, some accounts say that was the 9th, some accounts say that was the 8th, and the historical Buddha following Krishna was the 9th. So you can place Krishna at around 3102 BC, which is a date I've discussed in the time of Kali Yuga. So there was an avatar of Vishnu in that figure, in Hindu legend and mythology, and by some accounts, again, around 550 BC, that the historical Buddha was the 9th avatar. I don't actually buy that scheme. I don't consider the historical Buddha to have been an avatar of Vishnu. So I go with the version that says that Krishna, 5,000 years ago, at the beginning of Kali Yuga, was the 9th avatar. And the 10th avatar, coming now to a theater near you, appears at the end of Kali Yuga, and that is the Kalki Avatar. Kalki Avatar is depicted in many ways in Hindu art. You know, that type of style of kitsch Hindu art that you see on calendars in cafes all over the subcontinent. But the archetypal image appears to be that of a white horse with no rider. So in some mysterious way, this is said to be the icon or image of the Kalki Avatar. It's quite a pregnant image. And I advise you to consider the fact that the horse has no rider. Or let's say the rider is not on the horse, but if there is a rider of the white horse of Kalki, how could we identify who the rider is? Good question there. A friend was just asking me. Let's see where I can go with that question in this talk. What I'm going to do is present point by point characteristics or qualifications by which to identify the Kalki Avatar. And the first point of identification goes to that image. There's a white horse, note the color, without a rider. So let's say the Kalki Avatar is whoever mounts the horse, whoever rises to the occasion, to use another expression. The horse is there. The power source for the Kalki Avatar is waiting, like a horse waiting to be mounted. But what are the conditions for the appearance of the rider? And when does the rider mount the horse? First thing to know about the Kalki Avatar is that it is not one individual. It is, you could say, an archetype or a role, and whoever fits that role is the Kalki Avatar. So there's no point in speculating that we can anticipate at the end of Kali Yuga one particular individual to appear who can be identified. That is not the case. I would use the word candidate. There are candidates for the role of Kali Yuga. And the moment has come right now, as I speak to you, for those candidates to step forward into the arena. And they must recognize that they are candidates. They must know what mission it is they are going to undertake. And then they take the responsibility to rise to the occasion and mount the white horse. So who can do that? Who can take that responsibility, and what does it entail? Another point to know about the Kalki Avatar is that it must be a man. So the rider is male, and the role is exclusive to the male gender of our species. Given that is so, let's consider the profile of the candidate. There are men living in the world today who can be candidates for that role, but it has exact and rigorous requirements. It has about 5 or 6 requirements. And they go like this. First, he must be, in his own right, a sovereign man. That means that he must be a man who has the intelligence and the moral fiber, the moral constitution, to stand completely independently in the world, to be an autonomous agent, a man who calls the shots, a man who knows his own will, lives by his will, and lives by his word. His word is a word of honor, and it is the law in his world. So he is a man that can be considered to have a type of dominance, but not the dominance of globalist psychopaths, not the dominance of those who want to control others for their own sense of power, not the dominance of men who want to control the social order through hierarchy or through structures of power. No, the sovereign man is his own source of power. So one of the first characteristics of the sovereign man is that he knows that whatever he does in life, as it involves others, he would do it anyway, completely on his own. His activity does involve others, and he can have dependencies and attachments in life, such as family, community, race, and nation. But his actions derive from the strength of his autonomy as a sovereign individual. That's the bottom line, and nothing changes that. So even though he may have dependencies and attachments, as I say, he could be a man coming out of a family. Every man comes out of some family. Those dependencies do not in any way determine his course of action. And he does not allow himself to be in any way compromised or subverted by the needs and dependencies of others around him. He doesn't ignore them, and he does what he can to live up to those dependencies. But those considerations are secondary. He knows that if he does not live up to his own sovereign being in the first place, then whatever he does in relation to others to help them or support them will not have the right foundation. That's the sovereign man. So if the sovereign man is not fundamentally directed by those dependencies, but rather by that which is innate to himself, something clear, crystal hard, inviolable, in the core of his identity as a man. That is what directs him, or that is what provides the foundation for the course that he undertakes in life if he assumes the responsibility to mount the horse. The second requirement for the Kalki Avatar is that he has an ideology. He has an ideological viewpoint. And that ideology must be a racial ideology. So he has a view of races. He has a view of the human species as a whole, humanity as we call it. And then he has a view of the particular significance and role of different races, the whole spectrum of races that grow from the single human genome, you see? So his sense of humanity and of himself stands in this perspective. He has a perspective on race. This is essential to the mindset and motivation of the Kalki Avatar. Elsewhere, I've spoken of the factor of self-love and how important that is. It would be a digression to say anything on it here, but I will point out that self-love is an essential component of the sovereignty of any individual, be it man or woman. Look at a child of 5, 6, 8, 10, going into the teens. That child, be it a boy or a girl, will be able to move into the dramas of life, the commitments, the challenges, the dependencies, with sovereignty, with confidence, honor, and courage, if the child has a core of self-love. So in the core of his autonomy, the Kalki Avatar has the self-love, and that love is reflected externally or mirrored in those whom he chooses to love, because love is a choice. And so, the first instance to which he applies the expression of his self-love toward the love of others is toward his own immediate race, toward his racial ancestry, toward his parents, grandparents, and toward those who live in the immediate community who are members of his race. The Kalki Avatar puts his race, his people, his nation first. Doesn't mean that that excludes the concern or recognition of other races, but he knows a fundamental truth, that you can only serve the general good of all races if you serve and preserve the goodness that is in your own race. So the Kalki Avatar has a sense of posterity, that is to say, both of the races behind him that have created the individual that he is, and the future of the particular race into which he is born. And these are sovereign principles, and they are not negotiable, and they are as absolute and categorical as any values can get, or as any values that a human animal can conceive. And without them, the Kalki Avatar has no basis to act. They are the fundamentals that direct his course of action in the world. Third requirement is that the Kalki man, as I'll call him now, has an historical perspective. There's a better way to say that. You could call this quality or factor historic conscience. What is historic conscience? Well, it's a sense of conscience, that is to say, the basis of determining what is right or wrong, that relies on an historical perspective. So the Kalki man is historically educated in the truth of the events of history based on the evidence, the facts and the evidence, and what can be proven. So he must distinguish himself by that ability to discriminate, to discern which historical narratives are lies and which historical narratives are truths based on facts and evidence. And he must know this. He must be able to see this, because his role as the Kalki Avatar requires taking responsibility in the current historical situation the world is facing. You cannot act in the current historical situation without the background knowledge of the actual history that has happened and how the events of that true and provable history led to the events of today. So the Kalki man has historic conscience, and he belongs to that genre of education which has been called historical revision or historical review. For instance, the review of the history of World War II in the 20th century. What versions of that history are correct based on fact? What versions of that history are lies, intentional deceits? What versions of the history of that war rely entirely on war propaganda rather than on the actual facts and circumstances that transpired, particularly during the 12-year period between 1933 and 1945. Now, there's a secondary aspect in the historical perspective of the Kalki Avatar. The man who learns the truth about history finds in the past that there were certain individuals with which he can identify. And so he sees them as exemplars, or role models, if you will, that support the choice he makes in his own mission to be an active agent in history, in the living moment of history. That approach to the character and morality of the Kalki Avatar begs the question, well, if a Kalki man is looking back, reviewing history and revising history according to the evidence, does he find individuals who were themselves before him Kalki Avatars? Have there already been Kalki Avatars before the year 2021? There most certainly have been. There most certainly have been men and even boys who mounted the white horse and took the responsibility for that mission that comes with being Kalki. I'm not going to name any of them, but I will say that they exist, and you can find them if you go back into the true record of history, and particularly if you go back to the primary sources. So it's a matter of tragic, shall I call it tragic? No, it's a matter of vile deceit in our time that those individuals, say in the 20th century, who can be identified as Kalki men, are among the most demonized figures in history. And the world at large has been taught to hate them and despise them. But they are, in fact, the preceding examples of men who assumed the role of Kalki in recent historical times. Coming to the fourth requirement, this is something that can be defined in a single word, which is Morbido. Now, Morbido is not a word that is used conventionally in the way I'm going to use it now. I believe that Morbido is a term from art. I believe that it refers to a certain style of drawing, perhaps black and white drawing, where you give a dark shade to a certain scene or a still life. I'm not talking about the artistic style of Morbido. I'm talking about the moral imperative of Morbido. And of course, Morbido refers to death. So Morbido is the power to kill. And you can contrast it to libido. Libido and Morbido form a dyad. And if you look at nature, you can see libido and Morbido operating everywhere you look, from the microbial level up through all the kingdoms of nature. So you see, in all the animal forms, including birds, including insects, reptiles, and all the great animals, you see libido, that is to say, those animals reproduce themselves through the sexual drive. And you can also see morbido. They kill. They are predators. So in a way, and I like this definition more than anything, the morbido is the cold, white, arrow-like focus of the high predatory skill of the human animal. The humans are obviously the greatest predators on the planet. Carlos Castaneda years ago reported in his conversations with Don Juan that the topic of topics for shamans was predation. And predation is the great issue of our time. The globalist psychopaths, who are toxic narcissists, are in their own way predators. In order for them to be defeated, there must be superior predators. And of course, the predators who would defeat them would not be anything like them. They would not have the same personality type, nor the same motivation. But they would be men, and in some cases women, although women don't strictly qualify as the Kalki Avatar, women also, in some cases, do share this capacity to be predators, that is to say, to have morbido, and to be willing to kill. Now, willing to kill is a large statement. More comprehensively, I need to say ready, willing, and able. And of course, not everyone is ready, willing, and able to kill another human being. But the Kalki Avatar must be. This is a strict and categorical requirement. Morbido is a powerful concept that I've introduced over a number of years now, And if you want an icon or image for that concept, then look at the thumbnail for this talk. That implement, that artifact from the Second World War is the symbol of Morbido. A couple of other aspects of Morbido to understand, essentially, go like this. In the first place, the willingness to enter into a violent action and kill someone for the Kalki Avatar who has Morbido is not merely a matter of self-defense. It could be said that defending yourself to the point of killing someone in an act of self-defense is justifiable. You may or may not believe that. You may or may not accept that that is categorically correct and justifiable. Certainly, the predators, the psychopathic, demented predators who are running the world order today, who think they are, do not want people to act in self-defense. But the action of Morbido for the Kalki Avatar goes way beyond self-defense. Morbido is not merely the willingness and recognition of the necessity to kill. It carries the desire to kill in instances where self-defense is not even involved. Why is that so? Simple. There are two factors that must be faced by every Kalki warrior in our time, and more, even by ordinary people on a day-to-day basis. Two factors, two existential threats that must be faced. If someone stands before you, presuming to operate under some authority, and they act in such a way as to prevent you from exercising your freedom, not your rights, but your freedom to do as you wish, as long as you do not harm or deceive others, then you have what is called a confrontation. And there are two strategies for a confrontation. First is deterrence. So someone who is capable of fighting back, even to the point of exercising lethal force, has the ability to deter interference from someone else, from anyone representing the authorities, who are always hiding in their rat holes in the background. So it's like the situation with a schoolyard bully, isn't it? The child who stands up to the bully has deterrent power. But the child who wards off the bully and prevents the bully from antagonizing him must be able to back up that power. That situation goes to the second aspect of any confrontation. If deterrent force is not enough to prevent someone from interfering with your freedom, then there has to be full-on engagement. And that full-on engagement could, in some instances, require going to a lethal solution. If you don't get out of my way, I'm going to kill you. And this is how the Kalki Avatar views existential confrontations. All of them. All of them. Because they're all the same. And they all come down to the same fact. The interference with freedom. Not only telling people what they have to do, telling others what they have to do and how they have to live, but attempting to force them to do so. How does anyone deal with such a situation like that? Well, obviously, it takes a special kind of individual to face up to that situation and to triumph in that situation. and what it takes is what makes a Kalki Avatar, a Kalki man. There's a rigorous code of honor involved in the responsibility of Morbido. In the first place, the code of honor dictates that you would never use Morbido on a helpless person. There are no victims of Morbido. You do not, the Kalki man does not exercise Morbido recklessly on just anyone. The formula for choosing to use Morbido is simple. No harm intended, except to those who intend harm. So for those who intend harm and attempt to enforce authority on the freedom of others, Morbido is the core response. And the Kalki man is a living embodiment of Morbido. Finally, the fifth requirement or fifth characteristic is that the Kalki Avatar, although he stands autonomously and would do independently everything that he does in relation to others, nevertheless looks for his own kind. He looks for men who match him in honor and courage, men who will not misuse violence ever, men who will be extremely scrupulous, but also extremely discerning. There's an old saying, discretion is the better part of valor. So valor is the characteristic of honor and courage of any hero, be it man or woman. And when you have valor, you use it carefully and with discretion. So the Kalki man, the candidate, will look for this quality in other men as well, and he will only want to associate with those who hold the same high standards as himself. So he looks for other members who belong to what can be called the warrior class. Now, I gave a talk on Red Ice 7 years ago, I think, about the emergence of the warrior class. So even though the Kalki man is independent and can do whatever he has to do on his own, he of course welcomes other men, his equals and peers, and they form the warrior class. Now again, if you want to look back in history to more recent times, the 20th century, or if you want to go back into further centuries, more distant in the past, you can find examples of the warrior class. For instance, the Arthurian knights of the legends of the Middle Ages formed a warrior class, you see? And also in the 20th century, if you look into the particular facts of World War II, based upon primary sources, not based upon what has been said about certain men, their motives and their ideology, but based upon what those men themselves said. That's the key. If you look at that, you'll find there was indeed a significant warrior class formed in the 20th century, and the men who belonged to that class were numerous. And they were not only men of military training in the prime of life and older veterans, but they were also boys from the age of 14. And they were all united because they knew they belonged to a warrior class, and they knew who the enemy was. The warrior must know who is the enemy. So all the candidates for the Kalki Avatar who fulfill these requirements would also see eye to eye on who and what is the enemy of life. And they would act together as a unity, even though they might have many, many differences in other aspects of their choices in life. They would be a unity as they view the paramount and supreme enemy of all the human races. And there is such an enemy. And the ideology of that enemy is communism. In concluding this talk, I'd like to point out what I'm not saying. I haven't said anything about what you might call the spiritual framework of the warrior class. That is to say, the totality of those men who take responsibility to mount the white horse of Kalki. I haven't talked about a commonality in their spiritual view. You know, I don't use that word spiritual. But let's say, or let's ask, do the men of the warrior class and the women who support them, who can also be in the warrior class, although they cannot, strictly speaking, assume the Kalki role, do they all share some kind of common outlook on the great questions of human existence? How did we get here? What is God? What is the purpose of human life? Do they? Well, they could. They might. The key to the unity of the greater philosophical perspective of the warrior class can be seen in one figure who was a warrior, Parsifal. So the legend of Parsifal is the key to the Kalki warrior identity, the master key. And so it follows, ideally, I would like to see it develop this way in the beauty to come. It follows that those in the warrior class would find their way to that legend, the legend of the Grail, the figure of Parsifal. And were they to do so, they would also find their way to the mysteries and to the fallen goddess scenario. Because the company of the Grail in that great medieval legend were actually the diaspora of initiates from the Gnostic mysteries of the East. So ultimately there is a spiritual or religious framework for the warrior class. But regardless of whether the individual candidates come to know that or not, how wonderful for them if they do. But regardless of that, they are all united and they all stand together in sharing these characteristics that I've outlined here in this talk on the Kalki Avatar. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.